Picture this. A princess enters the royal throne room, and within seconds, every single person in attendance, nobles, clergy, ambassadors, even her own father the king, begins covering their noses and backing away in horror. Not because of her appearance, but because of a stench so overwhelming, so putrid, that it literally silenced conversations mid-sentence and sent grown men retching into handkerchiefs. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain, whose rotting body became the most closely guarded secret in 17th century Europe, and whose condition would ultimately expose the horrifying price of royal inbreeding that had been hidden for generations. By 1680, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty had reached the pinnacle of its power, controlling vast territories across Europe and the Americas. But behind the golden facade of the Alcazar Palace in Madrid, a genetic nightmare was unfolding that would make modern horror films seem tame by comparison. Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip Roman, his niece-wife Mariana of Austria, carried within her decaying body the accumulated genetic damage of centuries of incestuous marriages. The smell that emanated from her wasn't just unpleasant. It was the literal stench of a bloodline rotting from the inside out. Court records from the period described the princess's condition in clinical detail that would shock even modern medical professionals. Her body produced a constant odor described as putrid fish mixed with rotting eggs and damp cemetery earth. The smell was so powerful that it could be detected through multiple walls and closed doors. Servants who were forced to attend to her would often faint from the concentrated exposure. The palace perfumers, considered the finest in Europe, tried everything: rose water, lavender oil, exotic spices from the Indies, even burning incense constantly around her, but nothing could mask the overwhelming stench of decay. What made this tragedy even more horrifying was that Princess Margarita Teresa was fully conscious and aware of her condition. Court witnesses described her standing perfectly still during dress fittings, tears streaming down her face as servants applied layer after layer of perfumed powder to her body, knowing it would make no difference. The psychological torture of being trapped inside a rotting body while maintaining royal dignity was beyond human endurance. She would spend hours staring at her reflection in mirrors, watching her skin take on the waxy, translucent appearance of the dying while still in the prime of her youth. The medical explanation for her condition reveals the true horror of royal inbreeding practices. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree shows a level of intermarriage so extreme that it defied basic biology. Margarita Teresa's parents were uncle and niece. Her grandparents were first cousins. Her great-grandparents were also related by blood. This wasn't occasional intermarriage. This was systematic genetic self-destruction practiced over centuries in the name of keeping the bloodline pure. The result was a concentration of recessive genetic disorders so severe that it manifested as literal bodily decay in living individuals. The princess suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as a combination of metabolic disorders, autoimmune diseases, and cellular breakdown conditions that caused her body to essentially decompose while she was still alive. Her skin would periodically slough off in sheets, revealing raw, infected tissue underneath. Her internal organs were slowly failing, producing toxins that her compromised liver and kidneys couldn't filter, leading to the overwhelming stench that made her presence unbearable even to those who loved her. But the physical horror was only part of the story. The psychological impact on the royal court was equally devastating. Ambassadors from foreign courts would arrive expecting the usual diplomatic ceremonies, only to find themselves in situations so surreal they struggled to maintain composure. The French ambassador Jean-Baptiste Colbert wrote in encrypted dispatches to Louis Vazibid, describing scenes where entire diplomatic meetings were abandoned because the princess's presence made it impossible for anyone to concentrate on anything except trying not to vomit. The Spanish royal family's response to this crisis revealed the depths of their denial about the consequences of their inbreeding practices. Rather than acknowledging the genetic disaster they had created, they doubled down on secrecy and superstition. They hired teams of physicians who were sworn to absolute secrecy about the princess's condition. They constructed elaborate protocols for managing her public appearances, including strategically placed servants with perfume dispensers and carefully timed interruptions that would allow her to leave events before her condition became completely unbearable for attendees. The king himself, Philip IV, was reportedly driven to private breakdowns by guilt over his daughter's condition. Court insiders described finding him weeping alone in his private chapel, praying desperately for divine intervention, while knowing deep down that this was the result of his own choices in continuing the family's incestuous marriage practices. The irony was crushing. In trying to preserve the purity of royal blood, they had created the most impure, corrupted bloodline in European history. The day-to-day reality of managing Princess Margarita Teresa's condition required an army of specialists and servants, operating under strict secrecy, oaths. Her personal chambers were located in a specially modified wing of the palace, with enhanced ventilation systems that were architectural marvels for their time. These systems used a complex network of hidden air shafts and wind-powered fans to constantly circulate fresh air through her living spaces. Despite these innovations, servants assigned to her personal care had to work in rotating shifts because prolonged exposure to her condition would leave them violently ill for days. The princess's daily routine became a carefully choreographed medical procedure disguised as royal protocol. Each morning, her ladies-in-waiting would begin a process that took nearly 4 hours to complete. First, they would bathe her in specially prepared solutions containing exotic herbs, minerals, and perfumed oils imported from across the Spanish Empire. The bathwater had to be changed multiple times during each session, as it would quickly become contaminated with the toxins seeping from her compromised skin. The servants responsible for disposing of this bathwater had to wear cloth masks soaked in aromatic oils to prevent themselves from becoming sick from the concentrated exposure. After bathing, the princess's skin would be carefully examined by court physicians for new lesions, areas of breakdown, or signs of infection. These examinations revealed the progressive nature of her condition. Patches of skin that appeared healthy one day would be visibly deteriorating the next. The physicians documented these changes in secret medical journals that were kept under lock and key in the royal archives. These documents, discovered centuries later, provide a detailed record of genetic disease progression that modern medical science has confirmed as consistent with severe metabolic and autoimmune disorders. The process of dressing Princess Margarita Teresa required specialized clothing designed to minimize the impact of her condition while maintaining royal appearance standards. Her garments were made from specially treated fabrics that had been soaked in perfumed solutions and allowed to dry thoroughly before being sewn into final form. Multiple layers of undergarments contained sachets of aromatic herbs and powders that were changed several times daily. Her outer garments were designed with hidden ventilation features and were never worn more than once before being destroyed, as the smell would permeate the fabric permanently. The princess's jewelry presented unique challenges for the royal jewelers. Traditional metals would tarnish rapidly when in contact with her skin due to the chemical composition of the toxins her body was producing. Special alloys had to be developed that could resist this corrosion while maintaining the appearance of precious metals. Even these specially treated pieces required daily cleaning and polishing to prevent visible deterioration that might reveal the extent of her condition to observant courtiers. Princess Margarita Teresa's younger brother Carlos presented an equally horrifying example of genetic collapse, though his condition manifested differently. While she rotted from the inside out, Carlos was physically and mentally destroyed by the same genetic concentration. His tongue was so oversized that he could barely speak. His jaw was so malformed that he couldn't chew solid food. His legs were twisted by rickets, his brain damaged by hydrocephalus, and his reproductive organs so underdeveloped that he would never be capable of producing an heir, despite desperate attempts by the royal physicians. The contrast between the siblings revealed the random but devastating nature of genetic damage from inbreeding, while Carlos's deformities were visible and obvious, making him clearly unfit for royal duties. Margarita Teresa's intelligence remained largely intact, even as her body deteriorated. This created a particularly cruel situation where she was fully aware of her condition and its implications, understanding that she was watching herself decay while being powerless to stop the process. Court observers noted that she would sometimes speak with startling clarity about her situation, displaying an understanding of her family's genetic problems that was remarkably sophisticated for the medical knowledge of the time. The court's attempts to manage these genetic disasters became increasingly desperate and bizarre. They hired exorcists, convinced that demonic possession was causing the royal family's physical degradation. These exorcism ceremonies were conducted in secret chambers deep within the palace, with elaborate rituals involving holy relics, blessed oils, and incantations designed to drive out evil spirits. The princess was subjected to these procedures repeatedly, enduring hours of religious ceremonies that only added to her physical and psychological suffering while providing no medical benefit. They consulted alchemists who promised magical cures involving the blood of exotic animals. One particularly elaborate treatment involved bathing the princess in a mixture containing the blood of 7 different species of birds, each killed during specific lunar phases and prepared according to ancient formulae. Another treatment required her to consume daily potions made from powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, mixed with various herbs and minerals. The cost of these treatments was astronomical, requiring the royal treasury to fund expeditions to remote parts of the world to obtain the required materials. They even imported practitioners of forbidden arts who claimed they could reverse the family's genetic damage through ritualistic treatments. These practitioners, operating under the protection of royal patronage despite church prohibition, conducted ceremonies involving complex geometric patterns, mystical symbols, and what they claimed were ancient healing energies. Some rituals required the princess to lie motionless for hours, while practitioners chanted in languages that may have been completely fabricated. None of these treatments provided any improvement in her condition, and some may have actually worsened her suffering by adding psychological stress to her already overwhelming physical pain. Nothing worked because they were treating the symptoms of a biological catastrophe while continuing to cause the underlying problem. The royal family's refusal to acknowledge the genetic basis of their problems meant that they continued to plan marriages between closely related family members, even as the evidence of genetic damage became undeniable. This denial was supported by the prevailing religious and political beliefs of the time, which held that royal blood was divinely blessed and that any problems must be due to external influences rather than inherent genetic flaws. The princess's condition worsened dramatically during her teenage years. By age 16, the smell had become so overpowering that special architectural modifications were made to the palace. Ventilation systems were installed specifically to handle her presence in different rooms. These systems represented cutting-edge engineering for the 17th century, using principles that wouldn't be fully understood by medical science until centuries later. The palace architects created a network of air channels that could be opened and closed to direct fresh airflow and remove contaminated air from areas where the princess spent time. Entire wings of the palace were evacuated when she needed to move through them. Palace protocol required advance notice of her movements so that servants could clear corridors and prepare ventilation systems. Special routes were planned for her daily activities to minimize contact with other court members while still allowing her to participate in essential royal functions. The logistics of managing her daily life became a massive coordination effort, involving dozens of servants, multiple physicians, and carefully orchestrated timing to minimize the impact on court functions. The psychological impact on other members of the royal family was severe and long-lasting. Her mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, reportedly developed what would now be recognized as clinical depression, spending long periods in self-imposed isolation and religious contemplation. The Queen blamed herself for her daughter's condition, correctly intuiting that the family's marriage practices were responsible, but lacking the scientific knowledge to understand precise mechanism of genetic inheritance. King Philip IV aged rapidly during his daughter's illness, developing what court observers described as a nervous condition that caused his hands to shake and his speech to become hesitant. The king's guilt over his role in perpetuating the family's genetic problems was compounded by his political responsibilities to maintain Spain's position in European power struggles. Foreign courts were beginning to view the Spanish royal family's obvious genetic problems as a sign of divine displeasure or inherent weakness that could be exploited in diplomatic negotiations. The princess's younger siblings were also affected by witnessing her deterioration. Prince Carlos, already struggling with his own genetic problems, became increasingly withdrawn and fearful, apparently understanding that he might develop similar symptoms. The other children in the royal family were subjected to increased medical scrutiny as physicians attempted to detect early signs of genetic disorders. This constant medical attention created an atmosphere of anxiety and fear that pervaded the royal household. Foreign diplomats began to use the princess's condition as intelligence about the Habsburg family's fitness to rule. Encrypted reports flowed back to capitals across Europe, describing not just her physical state, but the obvious implications for the dynasty's future. These reports became crucial intelligence in the brewing succession crisis, as other European powers began to position themselves to claim Spanish territories when the Habsburg line inevitably collapsed. The French court, in particular, used detailed descriptions of the Spanish royal family's genetic problems to support their claims to Spanish territories through marriage connections. Louis XIV diplomats argued that the Spanish Habsburgs' obvious unfitness to rule created a moral obligation for healthier royal lines to assume responsibility for Spanish territories and subjects. These arguments would later provide partial justification for French territorial claims during the War of Spanish Succession. Austrian Habsburg relatives also received detailed reports about their Spanish cousins' conditions, leading to growing alarm about the genetic stability of their own branch of the family. The Austrian court began quietly modifying their own marriage practices, seeking spouses from more genetically distant royal lines to avoid repeating the Spanish catastrophe. This marked one of the first instances of royal marriage policy being influenced by primitive genetic understanding, though the scientific basis wouldn't be fully understood until much later. A princess's daily routine became increasingly restricted as her condition worsened. By age 17, she could only appear in public for carefully planned and time-limited events. These appearances required extensive preparation, including the deployment of multiple perfume dispensers, strategic positioning of servants with aromatic materials, and careful attention to wind direction and air circulation. Even with these precautions, her public appearances often ended abruptly when her condition became too overwhelming for attendees to endure. Religious ceremonies presented particular challenges because the confined spaces of palace chapels concentrated her odor to unbearable levels. Special arrangements had to be made for her participation in mandatory religious observances, including the construction of a separate viewing area with enhanced ventilation and the use of multiple censers burning specially blessed incense. Even these measures often proved inadequate, leading to situations where religious ceremonies had to be interrupted or abandoned due to the princess's presence. The impact on palace staff was severe and created ongoing personnel management problems. Servants assigned to the princess's care had to be rotated frequently to prevent long-term health problems from exposure to her condition. Many servants developed chronic respiratory problems, persistent nausea, and what would now be recognized as symptoms of chemical sensitivity. The palace had to maintain a larger-than-normal staff to accommodate these rotation requirements and to have replacements available when servants became too ill to continue their duties. Compensation for servants willing to work in close proximity to the princess had to be significantly increased, creating budget problems for the royal household. Special bonuses, additional time off, and priority access to medical care were provided to servants in these positions. Despite these incentives, turnover remained high, and the palace constantly struggled to maintain adequate staffing for the princess's care. The princess died at age 19, though the exact cause was never officially recorded. Witnesses described her final weeks as a merciful release from suffering that had become unbearable. Her body had essentially given up the fight against the genetic damage that had been accumulating for generations. The gradual failure of her major organ systems created a cascade of medical crises that 17th century medicine was completely unable to address. In her final days, the princess's condition deteriorated rapidly. The stench that had tormented her throughout her teenage years became so concentrated that even her most dedicated attendants could only remain in her presence for minutes at a time. Her skin, which had been gradually breaking down over years, began sloughing off in large sections, revealing the massive internal damage that had been hidden beneath the surface. The toxins her failing liver and kidneys could no longer filter began affecting her mental state, causing periods of delirium alternating with moments of heartbreaking clarity about her situation. The funeral was conducted with unprecedented secrecy, partly out of respect for royal dignity, but mostly because her corpse presented logistical challenges that had never been encountered in royal protocol. Traditional lying-in-state ceremonies were impossible due to the condition of her body. The coffin had to be specially constructed with multiple layers and sealing mechanisms to contain the odors and prevent contamination of the ceremonial spaces. Even with these precautions, the funeral ceremony had to be significantly abbreviated, and attendance was limited to essential participants only. The princess's death created a complex problem for royal record-keeping and historical documentation. The official cause of death was recorded simply as fever, but private medical records revealed the true extent of her genetic disorders. These private documents were kept separate from official palace records and were not discovered by historians until centuries later. The discrepancy between public and private records became a pattern that the Spanish royal family would follow in dealing with genetic problems throughout the remainder of their dynasty. Modern medical analysis of historical records suggests that Princess Margarita Teresa suffered from a combination of genetic conditions, including Prader-Willi syndrome, various metabolic disorders, and autoimmune diseases that caused her body's systems to break down systematically. The rotting smell was likely the result of ketosis, bacterial infections, and cellular death occurring faster than her compromised immune system could handle. Her case represents one of the most extreme examples of genetic damage from inbreeding ever documented in European royal history. Contemporary genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals an inbreeding coefficient that approaches levels seen in laboratory experiments designed to study the effects of extreme genetic isolation. The mathematical probability of the genetic disorders observed in Princess Margarita Teresa and her brother Carlos was virtually certain, given their parentage and family history. Modern computer models of genetic inheritance predict outcomes remarkably similar to what actually occurred in the Spanish Habsburg line. The tragedy of Princess Margarita Teresa became a turning point in European royal marriage practices, though not immediately. Her death, combined with her brother Carlos' obvious unfitness to rule, began a slow recognition among royal houses that genetic diversity was not just preferable, but essential for dynastic survival. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with Carlos II's death in 1700, triggering the War of Spanish Succession as other European powers fought over the remnants of their empire. The legacy of the rotting princess extends far beyond medieval royal politics. Her story became a powerful symbol of the consequences of ignoring biological realities in favor of political convenience. Medical historians use her case as a teaching example of how genetic disorders can accumulate and intensify through repeated inbreeding. Her suffering, while tragic on a personal level, helped establish the scientific understanding that would eventually lead to modern genetics and the recognition that genetic diversity is essential for healthy populations. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Princess Margarita Teresa's story is how completely her suffering was hidden from history. Unlike her brother Carlos II, whose physical deformities were documented in official portraits and diplomatic reports, her condition was considered so shameful that most records were deliberately destroyed or hidden. The few accounts that survived were found in private letters, and encrypted diplomatic communications that weren't meant to be preserved for posterity. The Spanish royal family's response to her condition revealed the ultimate failure of absolute monarchy, the inability to acknowledge reality when it contradicted royal mythology. They chose to hide the evidence of their genetic disaster rather than confront the practices that caused it. This denial continued even after her death, as subsequent royal marriages continued the pattern of intermarriage, though with gradually decreasing frequency as the consequences became impossible to ignore. Today, Princess Margarita Teresa's story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of isolated populations, whether royal families or modern communities with limited genetic mixing. Her tragic life and horrifying death marked the end of an era when political considerations could override biological realities. The stench that silenced the royal court was ultimately the smell of a dynasty's death. A genetic time bomb that had been ticking for centuries, finally exploding in the form of a young woman whose body became a living symbol of the price of genetic purity. The rotting princess had indeed silenced the royal court, but not through royal dignity or political power. She silenced it through the undeniable reality of biological consequences that no amount of royal pretense could overcome. Her legacy is written not in official histories, but in the genetic understanding that emerged from the ashes of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, ensuring that such genetic tragedies would never again be hidden behind palace walls.